wondering whether I should read poetry or prose tonight or a combination, and after the session this afternoon that produced so many agricultural questions, I decided I would read an agricultural short story. This story deals, as you'll see, with a number of agricultural issues, but it deals with them at a point at which they lie beyond the reach of essays. That is, when the issues begin to be dealt with by individual people. This story takes place in January 1953, and in case someone is here who has read The Memory of Old Jack, this is the immediate sequel. The story is called It Wasn't Me. The crowd in the courthouse square in Hargrave has not begun to assemble yet. The various pieces of it are now present, but scattered about. Half a dozen bidders or potential bidders, a few who have come out of concern or interest or curiosity, a few who are on hand simply for whatever may happen, as if in loyalty to the present tense of the county's history. Wheeler Catlett has been studying the scene below him now for some minutes, its several components as telling to him as sentences written in his own hand. You all hearing me all right? Is that going to be better? Okay, I didn't anticipate when I started that was going to happen, though I assume it's necessary. If it's an escape valve, we should be grateful. Wheeler Catlett has been studying the scene below him now for some minutes, its several components as telling to him as sentences written in his own hand. He stands motionless at the window. The room behind him is thoroughly forgotten, as if he is not in it, his right elbow propped on his left hand, his chin resting on his right thumb. He has been preparing himself for weeks for what is about to happen. And yet, since what is about to happen is still, so far as he can tell, unpredictable, he is not ready. On the least busy side of the square, Elton and Mary Penn are sitting in their car, watching the courthouse door, not moving, not talking. Their car is an old Dodge coupe, black under the dust. Along the side that Wheeler can see, there is an elongated fan of dried mud. On the opposite side of the square, Clara and Gladstone Pettit are standing on the sidewalk with their lawyer. The three of them have not moved beyond the pale blue aura of Glad's burnished Cadillac. Talking, they stand close together, as if aware of their difference from everything else in sight. Clara is wearing a fur coat and hat and gloves. Glad has on a pearl gray overcoat and hat. The lawyer, a man much younger than Glad, coatless as if by misunderstanding of the weather, stands with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched, looking curiously around him as he listens to Clara, who Wheeler imagines is telling him that this was a familiar place to her in her girlhood. And he can imagine her tone of disparagement. Well, we thought it quite a city. We were, you know, so far from everything. No one would know from looking at her that Clara ever rode into Hargrave behind a team of mules. She looks like a stranger, which Wheeler guesses is how she means to look. But from his window he can see, too, beyond the cornices along Front Street, the wide, slow-flowing river reaching westward, making its great difference, which, as always, consoles him for lesser ones. Now the wind has roughened it, and under the brilliant sky its surface blinks with white caps. Wheeler watches the triad of the two Pettits and their lawyer with distaste, but mainly out of curiosity now, for they are no longer the problem. The problem is now in the intentions and the eligibility of certain would-be buyers of a certain farm in whose fate Wheeler is urgently involved. And he is involved now as the unfeed agent of a dead man. Clara Pettit's father, old Jack Beecham, was Wheeler's client, his kinsman by marriage, and his friend. Old Jack was one of that venerable school of farmers and stockmen whose life was regulated by the knowledge of what a good one was and meant. Horses, mules, cattle, sheep, hogs, and people all submitted in his mind to the measure of that height of excellence represented by the known, proved, and remembered good ones of their respective kinds. Old Jack knew a good one when he saw one, and Elton Penn was a good one, and so was Mary, Elton's wife. The Penns moved to old Jack's farm as his tenants at the time old Jack finally gave up his lonely independence and moved to a room in the hotel in Port William 9 years before he died. The Penns proved satisfactory. They proved, in fact, far more than satisfactory. They were good. They were old Jack's kind. They listened to him and cared about him. They were the chief pleasure of his final years. Old Jack wanted them to have the farm after his death and wanted the farm to have them after his death, for he knew that they would care for it. And to that purpose, he willed them what he thought would be half the purchase price. As Wheeler told Elton on the afternoon old Jack was buried, old Jack also set the purchase price. But he did not do that in his will. He should have done so, but he did not. At that time, he had hesitated to state so finally and formally what he knew, that Clara cared nothing for the place and would sell it as soon as it became hers. The father and daughter were irreconcilably different, irreconcilably divided, and yet he loved her, and he was torn. So he left the farm to Clara and the empowering sum of money to Elton and Mary. He set the price several years later in a letter to Wheeler in, of all places, the little notebook that he kept in the bib pocket of his overalls and that they found there after he died. By the time he wrote the note, old Jack was often absent from himself. He apparently wrote it in some passing moment of realization and anxiety and then forgot it. For how long before he died, Wheeler does not know. The note, the pencil scrawl trenched deeply into the tiny page, read, "Wheeler, see the boy has his place, $200 acre, be about right. She ought to not complain. Wheeler, see to it." The slow, crooked legend of that page fell upon Wheeler's conscience with a palpable gravity, as if the old man had reached out from beyond the grave and laid his hand on him. The letter, of course, was of no legal worth whatsoever. In the eyes of the court, it would answer no pertinent question. Who was the boy? What was his place? Who was Wheeler? Who, for that matter, wrote the letter? But Wheeler, had he been the one to be held, would have been held tighter by that letter, that outcry, than by the will itself. He himself had no question as to the intention or the authenticity of the letter, and he assumed that Clara, understanding what was obviously her father's dying wish, would be bound by it as a matter of course. He was mistaken. He had done his assuming as he often did in a world that he assumed was ruled by instinctive decency. That Clara and Glad Pettit did not inhabit that particular world, they let him know fast. After the reading of old Jack's will, Wheeler asked them to remain in his office to speak privately with him. He thereupon showed them the letter in the little notebook, explained what it meant, and suggested that they proceed with the sale of the farm to Elton and Mary Penn at the stipulated price. Clara quickly glanced at her husband in a way that alone ought to have informed Wheeler that he had driven his ducks to the wrong pond. "No," Glad Pettit said, and then Clara herself said, "No." That was not a reply calculated to please Wheeler, and it certainly did not. It surprised him, too. He was surprised at Clara, and surprised at the extent of his own innocence, which had left him now without a plan. He had begun the conversation leaning back in his chair. Now he sat forward, lacing his fingers in front of him. Making an effort to suppress his irritation, he said, "Excuse me, Clara, but are you sure you understand the reasons for what I just proposed?" "Yes," she said, looking at Glad and then back at Wheeler. I understand. Of course I do. Wheeler studied her, a plumpish lady, now beyond her middle years, opulently dressed, her perfectly manicured hands resting on her purse in her lap. She was wearing a smart little pillbox hat with a veil, and behind the veil her eyes were looking straight at Wheeler. She did understand. She knew exactly what she was doing, and yet he was not ready to give up. Surely you can't feel that you're being deceived. The letter there in the little notebook, no court would honor it, of course, but among us there can be no doubt. I have no doubt. And this is a most deserving young couple. I don't have to tell you how well and honorably they've taken care of the place and how kindly and hospitably they treated your father. Seeing the embarrassment that Wheeler intended for Clara, Gladstone Pettit stepped in. A man of impeccable good looks, to which his aging had so far added only distinction, and manners precise as clockwork, Glad saw the difference between Wheeler's argument and its own barest essentials. Wheeler, you as a lawyer and I as a banker know that this is purely a matter of law, of principle, I would say. The kindness of this young couple was undoubtedly great. We don't question it. They have our gratitude. But their kindness was not to Clara, it was to her father, and it has been amply, some would say extravagantly, repaid. As for their farming, it was done in fulfillment of their half of a contract, of which the other half was also well and honorably fulfilled. All Clara is asking for, Wheeler, is what is rightly hers. She has the right to fair market value for her property. Glad's voice had an unction in it that implied what he scrupled to say, that poor Clara would not, in fact, receive fair market value for her property because her father's too generous bequest to the Penns must be seen as, in effect, a deduction from that value. And his tone conveyed as well the implicit accusation that Wheeler, as old Jack's lawyer, being obviously of sounder mind, should have counseled him against such over-generosity. Neither the speech nor any of its implications suited Wheeler, who never had liked Glad's trick of reducing things to their barest, usually monetary essentials, his habitual reduction of principle to his own interest. And he disliked, too, to be put in the position, an odd one for a lawyer, of both knowing and resenting Clara's rights. He knew anyhow that he was licked, and in spite of himself, his exasperation had begun to show. While Glad talked, Wheeler had regarded him with a look suggestive that human discourse had not been expectable from that quarter. And then he swiveled his chair away from Glad in a movement that seemed not merely to dismiss him, but to forget him as well. He made himself smile and addressed his final plea to Clara. It's not a question of what was owed and what was paid, Clara. That wasn't what Uncle Jack had on his mind. There were other questions that he put ahead of that one. What would be best for this good pair of young people? What would be best for this good farm? What should be done here for the good of the world? Uncle Jack would have put it that way, and I hope you don't mind if I do. He thought it over a lot of times, and he concluded that the best thing would be to put the good people and the good farm together, to bind their fates together, so to speak. I know he thought about it that way. I heard him talk about it that way. It's not an old man's senile foolishness. He knew what he was doing. He paused, looking at Clara, and then he said, Clara, I don't know anybody more worthy to walk in your daddy's tracks than Elton Penn, and your daddy loved him. And that failed too, for Clara said, my father's loves are not mine. After that, the Pettits communicated with Wheeler by way of a Louisville lawyer of their own picking, and they had little enough to communicate. Old association, family ties, the dead man's wishes were left to blow as the wind listed. But old Jack's letter, failing to hold Clara, held Wheeler. His duties as executor of old Jack's will were soon fulfilled, but disemployment brought him none of the benefits of the disemployed. There was no rest in it for him, no possibility that he and the problem of the dishonored letter might leave one another alone. The farm, according to the Pettits' wishes, was to be sold at the courthouse door early in January. And until that day had passed, The problem was Wheeler's as much as it was Elton and Mary Penn's. It was not a problem appointed to him, but one that he inherited, a part of his own legacy from his deceased client and friend. Jack Beecham came back to haunt him, and often in the small hours of the night, Wheeler would find himself talking and arguing with the old man face to face. Trying to end these encounters, he would cry out in his thoughts, "But I did try. I can't, damn it, make 'em do it." And then he would think, no longer arguing, but only mourning, that the Pettits were playing a different game from any that old Jack had ever played, and living in a different world from the one that he had lived in. The letter in the little notebook was written in a language the Pettits did not speak. They and their kind had forgot the tongue in which an old man might cry out from his grave in love and in defense of a possibility no longer his own in this world. But it was not merely that the old man would not take no for an answer. Wheeler could not bring himself to offer it as an answer. The truth is that Wheeler is a seer of visions. Not the heavenly visions of saints and mystics, but the earthly ones of a mainly practical man who sees the good that has been possible in this world, and beyond that, the good that is desirable in it. Wheeler has known the 150 acres called until now the Beecham place all his life. It is a good farm, a third or so of it rough enough, but the rest of it plenty good, and all of it well cared for a long time. It is a pretty place, too. The fences and buildings have been kept up. The yard in front of the old house is full of low-spreading maples. Behind the house there is an ample garden plot with a grape arbor and a dozen old pear and apple trees. It is a place with good human life already begun in it, where the right sort of young man and woman could do well. Knowing all this, knowing the farm, knowing Elton and Mary Penn, Wheeler has irresistibly imagined the life they might live there. He does not think of it, of course, as the life they will live there, for he is aware of chance and human nature and mortality. But it is a life that they could hope to live, and a life that Wheeler believes a certain number of people in every generation must hope to live and try to live. Caring for Elton and Mary much as old Jack cared for them, he wants them to have that hope and make that effort there on old Jack's place where they have, in fact, already begun. And so Wheeler has a reason of his own not to take no for an answer. Though the direct way was now lost and the only available route appeared to wander in thicket and hollow without a plan, he would not give up. He did not give up when he learned for certain that there would be one strong contending bidder, nor when he learned that there would be at least two. He did not know what could be done, but he did not give up, and he found it necessary to exercise his stubbornness on Elton's behalf as well as his own. In addition to the good judgment and good sense that old Jack and Wheeler have admired in him, Elton has pride enough to overpower sense and judgment both. Such pride that, as Wheeler understands, puts him more in need of a friend than it will let him admit. Being old Jack's heir was a nervous business for Elton in the first place. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for a benefit that was unasked, unearned, and unexpected. Nothing in his character prepared him to be comfortable with an obligation he could not repay. His election, both public and unexpected, to sonship to a man already dead, took more getting used to than he'd had time for when he learned of the opposition between himself and the other heir. His impulse on hearing of that was to declare his own independence at any cost, to renounce his share in old Jack's estate along with whatever chance he had to buy the farm and simply walk off, flinging defiance behind him like a handful of ashes. "Whoa," Wheeler said. "Wait a minute now." And Mary Penn said, "Oh, Elton." Wheeler was standing with his hat and raincoat on in the middle of the kitchen floor, having just told them the outcome of his discussion with the Pettits. When he entered in response to their call, Elton and Mary had just sat down to supper. Though he had expected it, Wheeler was distressed by the intensity of Elton's embarrassment. "Elton," he said, "you can't do that." "Well, I'd like to know why in the hell I can't." Wheeler went to the table then and pulled out a chair and sat down. "Here, Wheeler," Mary said, starting to get up, "let me get you a plate." "No, don't, Mary. I have to go home." But he sat on with them while they ate, patiently explaining, though he knew that Elton knew, that there could now be no backing out. To go ahead was best in Elton's own interest, best in Mary's interest, best in the interest of any children they might have. "You've got to try for it, Elton," Mary said. "That's right," Wheeler said. "You're in a fix, I admit, that I didn't want to see you in and didn't think you'd be in. I know it won't be easy for you to try for it and lose it, and you could do it. But you could come out with the farm, too." He hushed and sat with his head down, looking at his hands at rest in his lap, thinking. Elton and Mary sat watching him, no longer eating. And then Wheeler raised his head and looked at them. "Listen," he said. "Think about Jack Beecham getting his start here way back yonder, 70 or 75 years ago. He was young and strong, excited by what he could do, demanding a lot of himself and of the place. And some things he asked were wrong. You've heard him tell it. He made mistakes that damaged him and the farm too, and that delayed and hampered him a long time. But he had the grace and the intelligence to learn and to keep on. And Ben Feltner, you know, who was his brother-in-law, but a second father to him too, stood by him and put in a word when it would help, and helped in other ways. And those years changed him. Going the rounds of his work year after year in spite of debt and failure, he slowly learned to do what his place asked of him. He became the man it asked him to be. He was 48 years old when his hard times ended. He had worked his way through and paid his debts and had his farm back in the clear again. I remember him from about that time. He and my daddy used to work together. They were two of a kind in a lot of ways, and I can tell you he was a good farmer. From about that time in his life, he knew exactly what his place could do, and he never asked for more. He didn't waste time expecting the wrong things. He got out of debt finally in, I think, 1908, and he worked on there until 1944, when we persuaded him, maybe wrongly I sometimes think now, to move to Port William. 36 years, and he made the place good. Well, you know the results of his work. What he'd understood was that the place is not its price. It's not even real estate. A farm-sized piece of ground is just half a farm, even if it has fences and buildings and tools. Its other half is a good farmer who knows it and cares about it. He knew what it had cost him to become that kind of farmer. He knew that what he knew and felt about his farm were its belongings, necessary to it. And he knew he was getting old. He was getting old, and he had no successor. He had an heir, but no successor. He must have guessed from pretty early that Clara wasn't going to care for the place, and her marriage to Glad Pettit settled that. As his own work days were coming to an end, he saw his farm going into a kind of widowhood. He couldn't have had much hope for it. He was able enough by then to resign himself to what he couldn't help, but I know it made him sad. He'd talk to me about it sometimes. And then you and Mary came along. He saw right away what the two of you and the old farm could mean to each other and what you meant to him. He saw that you could be the man the place was asking for, and his life's work might not go to waste after all. We've got to try it for Mr. Beecham's sake, Elton. Well, Elton said and cleared his throat. Well, of course, that's why we've got to try. Wheeler sat on with them for a while, talking of other things, looking around him at the signs of industry and frugality in the old room that old Jack had admired there. When he got up to go, he laid his hand on Elton's shoulder and said, "Don't worry." He knew it was useless to say that to Elton, but he meant it. His own determination had grown, for he was in the presence of what he desired. I don't know what we'll do, but we'll do something. That there was plenty to worry about was soon evident. Earl Benson, who lived on one of the farms adjoining the Beecham place, had bought two neighboring farms, the first of which joined his own original farm, the second being divided from it by the Beecham place. It was a pattern that did not leave much to guess. Earl Benson was expected to be a bidder, and gossip soon confirmed that he would be. Wheeler knew the man, had done legal work for him, in fact, and liked him. But he opposed his ambition too, and meeting him on the street one afternoon, he said to him, "Earl, if Elton Penn can buy the Beecham place, and he wants to, you'll have a good neighbor." To which Earl replied around his cigar pleasantly enough, "And if I buy it, I'll have a good farm." That didn't surprise Elton any more than it did Wheeler. "I figured that," Elton said. "If I was in his place, I reckon I'd try to buy it too." Wheeler was sitting in his car with the motor running, Elton leaning down to talk to him through the window. A few feet away, Elton's tractor was standing with its motor running. Wheeler had begun to make these visits almost daily, not because he had news for Elton that often, but because he was anxious and could not stay away. Wheeler's own farm was close by, and so it was easy for him when he went there to stop by to see Elton. He would drive to where Elton was working, and Elton would stop what he was doing, and they would talk a little. "With Earl in it," Wheeler said, "you'll have to bid higher than you want to. You might as well get ready for that." "I'm ready to go a little bit higher." Wheeler thought it would have to be more than a little bit, but he didn't say so. He said, "Well, I'll see you." 2 days later, Wheeler was stopped in the post office by Dr. Stedman. "Just the man I want to see, the very man," the doctor said, taking hold of Wheeler's elbow. "Wheeler," he said in the low, confidential voice with which some people talk to lawyers about serious matters, "I've got a little backlog of cash that I'm thinking of investing in land." "Well, do it," Wheeler said. He was in a hurry, and he was impatient anyhow of the doctor's persistent raids on him for free advice, legal and other, advice which he never took unless it was to do what he already intended to do. He wanted his intention confirmed and his reasoning admired. When the doctor starts with his questions, Wheeler always wants to say, "While we're standing here, Doc, would you mind taking my pulse?" But so far, he has never said it. He merely saves himself as much time and trouble as possible by discovering what the doctor wants to do and advising him forthwith to do it. Even so, he never escapes soon enough. He always has to suffer an explanation. "Well, now," the doctor said, "that old Beecham place up by Port William, I hear it's going to be sold at auction." "That's right." "I hear it's a good one." "Yes, sir, it's a good one." There was more, Wheeler knew, and he did not want to hear it. He shifted his weight to turn away, but the grip on his elbow tightened. "That young fellow who lives there, Elton Penn, I understand he made the old man a good tenant." "That's right." "Well," the doctor said, inhaling deeply, pursing his lips, looking up and looking down, "my thinking is this. If I bought the farm, he'd make me a good tenant. With my obligations, you know, I'd need somebody there who wouldn't require a lot of seeing to. Do you see what I mean?" "I do." "So if I could get the place and a good man on it at the same time, it would solve my problems, don't you see? It would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Wheeler knows very well the history of those 2 birds, the wish to own land and the wish to have somebody else worry about it, and there are certain things that he is prepared to say on the subject. But he gently frees his elbow and just as gently takes hold of the doctor's arm. "Doctor, do you know that Elton Penn wants to buy that farm for himself?" "No, sir, I didn't." "Well, he does. Listen, if you want to do a public service, get out of his way and let him have it." Wheeler turned away then, leaving the doctor's reply floating in the air. And so there was another bad possibility to warn Elton about. "I don't know how far he'll go," Wheeler said. "I don't know how much money he's got." "More than I got," Elton said. That Elton himself made the farm attractive to at least one of his competitors, Wheeler decided not to tell him. Standing at the window, looking down, Wheeler thinks again, as he has many times, of the terms of a possible surrender. If the farm goes too high, why should Elton not just let it go? He could have his money still. He could take his time and find another place to buy, one that maybe in the long run would suit him just as well. And that was all right as far as it went. But it left out old Jack, left his life's work to come to nothing. It left the letter in the little notebook unanswered. It failed to answer old Jack's and Wheeler's notion of what the farm itself needed and deserved. The living man, no more than the dead one, could bear to see the little farm's boundaries dissolved in Earl Benson's adding of house to house and field to field. And if the doctor bought it, Wheeler knows that story as well as if it had already happened. Elton would not stay, and the doctor was right in supposing that he needed Elton along with the farm. He needed somebody who knew how to farm it, for he did not know how to farm it himself. When Elton and Mary left, they would be followed by a procession of other tenants who would also leave, worse following worse, while the farm ran down. "No," Wheeler says aloud, "hell no." The sound of his own voice seems to move him. He glances at the clock on the courthouse tower and then looks at his watch. He turns, walks slowly, looking at the floor to the hat rack in the corner of the room, puts on his hat and coat, and returns to the window. Clara is talking animatedly with Gladstone and the lawyer, her coat collar turned up against the wind. As he watches her, it seems to Wheeler that she is elated, and he realizes with the sudden astonishment that one feels in looking into a life beyond the possibilities of one's own, that for her the sale of the old farm is a freedom, her own connection with it, her own early life there being merely an encumbrance, probably an embarrassment. This whole passage of time has been burdened for Wheeler by his dislike of the Pettits, and he feels it now. He feels it, exults in it a little, for he knows that it defines his true allegiance, and yet is sorry for it. How much better it would be to be at peace with them, fellow mortals as they are, kindred as they are. And yet he feels, as he knows old Jack felt, the irreconcilable division between his kind and their kind, between the things of this world and their value in money. Now the courthouse door opens. The auctioneer crosses the porch, takes his stand at the top of the steps, begins to summon the crowd. Buttoning his coat, Wheeler hurriedly crosses the room and goes out. "Back in a minute," he says to Miss Hallie, his secretary, as he strides through the outer office. She widens her eyes by way of comment as the door slams and his steps quicken going down the stairs. Outside, the unblemished winter sunlight and the strong wind fill the square. Wheeler comes out into it with a relief and a pleasure that are familiar to him. This is the sort of day that makes an active man working inside feel that he is missing something. The year is starting. The weather is busy. Out over the river, he sees a flock of birds fly up into the face of the wind and then turn as one away from it. Once he is in the street, with the square in sight again, he slows down, looking, pausing, speaking to passers-by as he makes his way toward the little crowd collecting at the foot of the courthouse steps. He lets the crowd shape itself before he gets there, and then he stops on its outer edge. The crowd is hollow-centered, a kind of diffidence making everybody stay back a little, not wanting to appear too interested. The Penns are standing in front of Wheeler on the inside of the ring. Wheeler sees Mary looking around for him. He catches her eye, gives her a quick nod and wink. She whispers to Elton then, her lips forming the words, "Wheeler's here." Elton nods, but does not look back. Mary is holding to Elton's right arm, huddled against him, more from nervousness, Wheeler knows, than from the chill of the wind. There is something in the set of Elton's head and shoulders that denies the crowd and sets him aside from it, even though he is in it. Dr. Stedman is standing close to the foot of the steps. He looks away when Wheeler looks at him and carefully does not look back. And then Wheeler catches Earl Benson's eye and nods, and Earl throws his head back, grinning on both sides of his cigar, and gives him a wave. The Pettits and their lawyer have moved closer to the crowd, but stand separate from it by perhaps 10 feet. They see Wheeler and nod, and he tips his hat. Though the day is brilliant and the sun in sheltered places gives some warmth, in the open square the wind presses upon them with an irresistible chill. People stand with their hands in their pockets and their shoulders hunched. The auctioneer gives a little introductory speech, welcoming everybody, describing the property to be sold, explaining the terms of the sale. And then starting into his spiel, he calls for a bid of $175 an acre. The figure is hardly named before Wheeler sees Elton nod. Well, that's aggressive enough, Wheeler thinks. He would have been a little slower than that himself, maybe, but he sees that Elton is performing in the way proper to him, with resolution and some speed, and he is pleased. Be careful now, he thinks. The doctor gives a little wave of his hand at $200, and at $225, Earl Benson says loudly, "Yeah!" And so they've gone beyond old Jack's price at a run. The auctioneer asks for $250. $2.35, Elton says, slowing it down, and Wheeler thinks, that's right. Earl Benson comes in quickly at $2.45. The spiel continues for some time after that without a bid. Elton and Mary are talking in whispers. The doctor shakes his head, turns away, and then changes his mind and bids again. $2.55. Earl Benson bids $2.65 as quickly as before. The doctor, finished, puts his hand back in his pocket and sidles back into the crowd. Wheeler's watching only Elton now, hoping he will bid again, but Elton is shaking his head at Mary, ready to quit. And then, making one of the sudden shifts from stillness to haste that is characteristic of him, Wheeler steps through the crowd just as Elton is turning away, and the auctioneer's hand is raised in the air. He stops at Elton's left shoulder, a little behind him, taking hold of his arm. Speaking into Elton's ear, he says, "Go on." And when Elton hesitates, "It'll be all right. Go on." And Wheeler knows. He can feel in his hand when Elton yields himself to his struggle again, can feel him settling onto his feet. $2.75, Elton says. The auctioneer looks at Earl Benson. His tone has grown quiet now and personal. The public auction reduced to a conversation among three men. He is asking Earl if he will pay $2.85. For a long time, Earl does not give any sign that he knows he is where he is. He is looking down, thinking, and Wheeler knows within a guess or two what he is thinking about. His land purchases so far have been manageable, but not without risk. He is here bidding at a further risk, and the risk is growing. He has a mortgage against his home place. He has the bank to account to. He has interest and wages to pay. He has bills for fuel and fertilizer and seed and parts and supplies. He has something to gain and perhaps more to lose. He stands with his head down while desire and pride argue with chance, mortality, and arithmetic. Finally, he raises his head, looks at the auctioneer, looks away, and nods. Before the auctioneer can begin his spiel again, Wheeler's hand is tightened on Elton's arm, and Elton has said, $2.90. That's right, Wheeler says. And there's another pause, and Earl Benson bids $2.95. Go on, Wheeler says, and Elton says $300. They wait then while the auctioneer speaks to Earl, who shakes his head once and again and turns away. The auctioneer brings his hand down. Sold to Elton Penn here for $300 an acre. Elton, shaken, still shaking, looks at Wheeler and grins. Is that me? And the auctioneer, overhearing, laughs and says, "You Elton Penn, ain't you, honey?" Wheeler leaves Elton and Mary to complete their purchase and goes back to his office. In the privacy of the dark stairway, he allows himself to grin at last, in relief and triumph, and in his mind he says to old Jack, "How's that?" And to himself he says, "And what's next?" He pretty well knows what is next. He's still hurrying. He shuts his office door and without taking off his overcoat and hat, picks up a yellow pad with some figures on it, reads them over, and then sits down and rapidly works his way through another set of figures. Elton and Mary have paid $100 an acre, more than the $200 stipulated by old Jack's letter. And so Clara's dishonoring of that letter has earned her and cost the Penns $15,000. The place has cost $45,000, of which old Jack's legacy to the Penns will cover a third, and Wheeler assumes that they will have savings that will increase that by somewhat. By Wheeler's own estimate, the farm would have been worth its price to anybody at $250 an acre, which puts Elton above the mark by $7,500. Going beyond $250, Wheeler thought beforehand and still thinks might be justifiable for Earl Benson, who owns adjoining land, or for Elton, whose occupation of the place and whose familiarity with it, both from his own experience and old Jack's instruction, would have a practical worth. Whether or not that worth would reach $7,500, Wheeler does not know. But at that point, he would, anyhow, shift the ground of justification. Elton and Mary ought to have the farm because they want it, because old Jack wanted them to have it, and because they're worthy of it. Studying his figures, considering all that he knows to consider, Wheeler concludes that the Penns are safe enough. Assuming that they can continue to do as well as they have done, they will own their farm, which is perhaps as good a chance as anybody could ask. But Wheeler is not done assuming yet. If he assumes, as he must, that if left alone, Elton would have stopped bidding at $235, then Wheeler must consider himself in some manner responsible for $9,750 of the pen's debt. He cannot come up with that kind of money without selling something that he ought to keep, and he does not need it now anyway. He may not need it ever, but he knows that he must regard it as one of the possible prices of his own freedom. He does another brief computation and picks up the telephone. He calls the cashier of the Hargrave Farmers Bank and finds that he can spare $1,000, and he arranges for the transfer of that sum to a savings account in the name of Beecham, Catlett, and Penn. "I'll send the check right over," he says. "Yes, that's right. That's the name of the company." He hangs up, takes a check pad from a drawer of his desk, writes out a check, and seals it in an envelope. He has been sitting upright on the edge of his chair, and now he leans back, pushes his hat off his forehead, and lapses into stillness. But even still, he remains expectant, listening, and soon he hears the street door open and shut, and then footsteps coming up the stairs. Miss Hallie opens the door. "Elton Penn is here." "Tell him to come in," Wheeler says, and then himself calls, "Come in, Elton." As Miss Hallie goes out, he hands her the envelope. "Take that to the bank, please." When Elton comes in, Wheeler grins at him. "Well, you come out all right, I think." "I don't know, Wheeler. I might have made one hell of a mistake." Elton is as tightly strung as a banjo, and there's a little glistening in his eyes. "Sit down," Wheeler says, and Elton does. "Well, it could have been better," Wheeler says. "No doubt about that." And then he grins again and says, "And it could have been worse. This was bad enough, maybe. What do you think?" "I think it was a shame it had to happen the way it did, a damn shame. I don't understand." Wheeler stops then and shakes his head. "But I suppose we mustn't say everything we think." He picks up the pad with his figures on it and looks at it, thinking for a minute, and then pitches it back onto the desk. "I know you're worried about the price, Elton, but it's an amount I think you can manage, if you live, of course, and stay on your feet." "I could get sick or die, too," Elton says. Wheeler laughs. "Of course you could, but I don't see how we can depend on that. I'm afraid we'll just have to assume that you won't. It's a risky business." He swivels his chair toward the window and looks at the sky a moment, recovering his thought, and then turns back to Elton. "In other words, I think you did what you should have done. You have the farm, and I believe you're going to be glad of it. And I'm glad of it. It's a great relief to me." "Well, of course, if I'd lost it, I'd have been sick, but I can still lose it." "No, my boy, you're not going to lose it. Not if we both can help it. I told you to go ahead because it would be all right. You must understand that I meant that. If you need help, I'm going to help you." "But God damn it, Wheeler, don't you think I ought to lose it if I can't make it on my own?" "No," Wheeler says, "I don't think that. I can see how a person might think that. It seems to me I thought something like that myself once, but I don't think it anymore." "It's the obligation, Wheeler." Elton looks up at Wheeler, and his eyes glisten again. "If it hadn't been for you, Wheeler, I'd have lost that farm today. I know it, and I appreciate it. But why should you have done that? Why should you have felt obliged to help me get into a problem that now you feel obliged to help me get out of?" Wheeler knows this longing for independence in Elton because he knows it in himself. He knows that he is a trespasser, and he feels suddenly heavy with the complexity and difficulty of what he has begun. But he is amused, too, and is trying not to show it. Like any young man who has won his heart's desire, Elton wishes he had won it by himself, wishes to possess it on his own terms, its first and only lover. "It wasn't me," Wheeler says, and is at once startled by his words and filled with a sort of glee by their truth. "It wasn't me. If I'd stood back and let you lose that farm or let it lose you, that old man would have talked to me in the dark for the rest of my life." "You did it out of loyalty to Mr. Beecham?" "Partly." Wheeler studies the man sitting in front of him, who is sitting there studying him, puzzled by him at the moment, Wheeler guesses, and waiting courteously for him to say what he is talking about. And Wheeler again feels his great liking for this Elton Penn, a young man, as old Jack would say, with a good head on his shoulders. He is an orderly man who makes order around him. The place, Wheeler says, is not its price. Its price stands for it for just a minute or two while it's bought and sold, and may hang over it a while after that and have an influence on it. But the place has been here since the evening and the morning were the third day. The figures are like us, here and gone. The figures make it mine, Elton says, if I can be equal to them. The figures give you the right to call it yours for a little while. They give me the right to do a hell of a lot more than that. For some time now, they do not say anything. There is more feeling in what Elton has said than he has found words for, and more than Wheeler wants to deal with in a hurry. Wheeler is amused by Elton's predicament, and yet is moved and troubled by it. Here is a young man whose experience has taught him the meaning of debt, who wants above all to be paid up and in the clear, and who has become first the inheritor of a bequest that he did not ask for and did not expect. Next, the beneficiary of an act of friendship that he did not ask for, and with part of his mind at least, does not want. Wheeler sits and looks at Elton while Elton sits and looks at the palm of his right hand, oppressed between gratitude and resentment. Watching him struggle in his confines, Wheeler realizes again the fatality of what he has undertaken. He has started something that he will have to finish, and how long will that be? People have been exercising those rights here for 175 years or so, he says finally, and in general they've wasted more than they've saved. One of the rights the figures give is the right to ruin. You're talking about something you learned out of a book, Wheeler. I'm talking about something I learned from Jack Beecham, among others, and something you'll learn too if you stay put and pay attention, whether I tell it to you or not. Do you know what I want, Wheeler? I expect I do, but tell me. I want to make it on my own. I don't want a soul to thank. Wheeler thinks too late, but he does not say it. He grins. That he knows the futility of that particular program does not prevent him from liking it. Well, he says, putting aside whatever Mary Penn might have to say about that, and putting aside what it means in the first place just to be a living human, I don't think your old friend has left you in shape to live thankless. He sees that Elton sees, or is beginning to. This man who longs to be independent cannot bear to be ungrateful. Wheeler knows that. But the suffering of obligation is still on Elton, and he says, what do you mean? I mean, you're a man indebted to a dead man. So am I. So was he. That's the story of it. Back of you is Jack Beecham. Back of him was Ben Feltner. Back of him was, I think, his own daddy. And back of him, somebody else. And on back that way, who knows how far. And I'm back of you because Jack Beecham is, and because he's back of me, along with some others. It's no use to want to make it on your own because you can't. Old Glad Pettit, I reckon, would say you can, but Glad Pettit deals in the kind of property you can put in your pocket and walk off with, or he thinks he does. But when you quit living in the price and start living in the place, you're in a different line of succession. Elton laughs. The line of succession I'm in says you've got to make it on your own. I'm in the line of succession of root hog or die. That may have been the line of succession you were in, but it's not the one you're in now. The one you're in now is different. Well, how did I get in it, Elton says, almost in a sigh, as if longing to be out of it. The way you got in, I guess, was by being chosen. The way you stay in is by choice. And I got in because Mr. Beecham chose me. And Mary, he chose you and Mary. He thought you two were a good match, and that mattered to him. His own marriage, you know, was not good. Yes, you could say he chose you, but there's more to it. He chose you, we'd have to say, too, because he'd been chosen. The line is long and not straight. Wheeler pauses for a minute. He's leaning a little forward now, his elbows resting on the chair arms, his hands loosely joined in front of him. And then we'd have to say that through him the farm chose you. Elton looks straight at him. The farm did? Wheeler smiles. The land expects something from us. The line of succession, the true line, is the membership of people who know it does. Uncle Jack knew it, and he knew you would answer. Now wait a minute, Elton says. Hold on, for the expectation seems to him too great. But Wheeler sees a little of the way ahead now, and he keeps going. We start out expecting things of it. All of us do, I think. And then some of us, if we stay put and pay attention, see that expectations are going the other way too. Demands are being made of us, whether we know it or know what they are or not. The place is crying out to us to do better, to be worthy of it. Uncle Jack knew that. Wheeler stops again and looks at Elton. He thought you were worthy. Do you remember that spring day when he first came to visit after you and Mary moved in? In May 1945, Elton says, the day Germany surrendered. Well, right then, he started hoping that you and Mary would own the farm. He mentioned it to me that same evening. I remember it very well. I said, well, what do you think of Elton Penn? And he said, I think he's a good one. But Wheeler, Elton says, and there's a catch of tenderness in his voice now, and there's some fear in it. Maybe he was wrong about me. Maybe, Wheeler says, but he didn't think so. He didn't change his mind in 8 years, and I don't think so. Elton sits with his head down, thinking. The question they have come to now requires a long proof. The burden of time is on him. When he dies, somebody will answer. Then he looks up again at Wheeler. So this has happened now because of all these things coming together, because Mr. Beecham wanted it to happen, and because the farm, as you say, wanted it to happen, and because you wanted it to, and because you and Mary wanted it to, Wheeler says. Elton looks at him and slowly nods. And because what has happened has been desirable to a lot of people we never knew who lived before us. Elton nods, looks down, thinks again, and again looks up. And you're saying you're going to be my friend because of all that? Yes, because of you yourself and because of all that. Elton laughs. You're going to be my friend, it sounds pretty near like, because you can't get out of it. If I was his friend, given what that meant, I can't get out of it. But Wheeler, that's pretty tough. It's tough. It's not as tough as being nobody's friend. You're saying there's not any way to get out of this friendship. No, you can get out of it by not accepting it. I'm the one so far who can't escape it. You have it because I've given it to you, and you don't have to accept. I gave it to you because it was given to me, and I accepted. Elton draws a long breath and holds it, looking out the window, and then breathes it out and looks at Wheeler. I can't repay him, Wheeler, and now you've helped me, and I can't repay you. Well, that's the rest of it, Wheeler says. It's not accountable. If the place was its price, or you thought it was, maybe you could consider such debts payable. But then some of those debts you wouldn't have contracted, and the rest you wouldn't recognize as debts. Your debt to Jack Beecham is a debt, and it's not payable, not to him anyhow. Your debt to me is smaller than your debt to him, not much at all, and it may or may not be payable to me. This is only human friendship. I could need a friend too, you know. I could get sick or die too. Elton says, well, but Wheeler raises a hand and goes on. It's not accountable because we're dealing in goods and services that we didn't make, that can't exist at all except as gifts. Everything about a place that's different from its price is a gift. Everything about a man or a woman that's different from their price is a gift. The life of a neighborhood is a gift. I know that if you bought a calf from Nathan Coulter, you'd pay for it, and that's right. But aside from that, you're friends and neighbors. You work together. And so there's lots of giving and taking without a price, some that you don't remember, some that you never knew about. You don't send a bill. You don't, if you can help it, keep an account. Once the account is kept and the bill presented, the friendship ends. The neighborhood is finished, and you're back to where you started. The starting place doesn't have anybody in it but you. It's before the line of succession, Elton says. That's right. Wheeler leans back in his chair now and spreads his hands and lets them hang relaxed over the ends of the chair arms. So, he thinks of old Jack again, at ease with that imperious ghost at last. He looks at Elton. So, there is to be no repayment because there is to be no bill. Do you see what I mean? Maybe. Elton grins, at ease now too, his hand fishing in his shirt pocket for his cigarettes. Probably. Wheeler laughs. Well, give me one of your smokes.